And we started talking about the organs involved in digestion, but that was a few weeks ago. I know that we had our lab exam, a different topic coming up the next day. And so this is going to be a nice little refresher. And as you go into your lab exam, or as you prepare for your lab exam, you want to make sure that you're using your lab notes with your lecture notes. Your lecture exam is next week on digestive. And so this really marks the end of the material for lecture. Again, and you'll have 3 more slides for lymphatics coming up, and it'll be a very short segment. It won't be much more to add, but you'll be taking care of that on your own during the week. But this will reflect a lot on the lab exam that's 2 weeks from now, and so it's going to be sort of a refresher on what we already know, but we need to add some more complicated topics or more deeper understanding. And so as we go through our digestive system, what you want to think about your body is you want to think of it as one giant worm. You want to think to yourself, there is an entry point and an exit point, and what is going on inside of that process. Everything that you consume is going to be consumed or ingested through the oral cavity and then eventually exit out through the anus as waste. And we're going to briefly talk about urinary next week to intro it for lab. And urinary will be a topic on the final exam, not the upcoming one. But one thing that we're going to see is that we produce 2 types of waste. We produce a waste from when we ingest materials, and anything going through this entire worm will only go through one pathway and then finally exit. Whatever you were not able to digest, whatever goes through your system and your body didn't need is going to leave from point B. Again, entry is again ingestion, and B is again producing that waste. And along the way, your food, if we magic school bust our way down into this worm-like system, then we would encounter different organs. Like we would just be traveling through many different organs and seeing their differences, and then how they each are involved in breaking down our food down into nutrition. And so first thing we have to address is what is the organs, or like what is digestive tract? The digestive tract is going to consist of oral cavity, which is going to be the mouth. The pharynx is the name given to the throat, the back of the throat. And then the esophagus is going to be this worm-like tube that goes all the way down from your pharynx, from your throat, all the way down to your stomach. During respiratory, we learned that our larynx sits right in the very front, that windpipe with the trachea, and then it goes to both lungs, but that sits anterior. And so you have 2 pathways, one that goes anterior and then one that goes posterior. And the one that goes posterior is going down your esophagus. This is a muscular tube where no real digestion or like absorption has really occurred yet, but really what it's for, it's passaging whatever you consumed down into your stomach. And then the stomach will then break things down through acidity, or through stomach acids, break it down. And as it's broken down, the small intestine will do a few things to prepare that very acidic content. And so the small intestine is next, and it becomes a prep station. We're going to call it that for now, just since we're talking about food. It's going to be like a prep station, meaning that food is prepared before going through the rest of the digestive tract. Because think about just naturally what we know about the stomach. We know that it has an acidic environment, and that acidity is about, I think, a pH about 2.75, and that is enough to digest your own organs. And so if you do not neutralize that acid a little bit before we go into the full range of the small intestine, then you'll digest yourself. There are diseases named after this fact. And so as that food is traveling through, being broken apart, this small intestine is where all the absorption is going to occur, meaning that all the blood vessels, which is going to be a content for lab today, is going to absorb all the nutrients that we are intaking. And so after that, we see that nutrition's going to travel, or anything that we ingested, after it's gone through its round of absorption, placed all its contents into the capillaries, it's then going to go into the large intestine. And this large intestine is then going to be 2 things. It's going to hold poop, and it's also going to do a second round of absorption. So not only does it hold feces, but it also absorbs any water you might need. It absorbs salts that you might need. In other words, like potassium, sodium, bicarbonate, anything that your body might need. Again, your large intestine can circulate or place it back into circulation if necessary. And so you can see why they're called intestines, but one has smaller tubes, small intestines, and then the large one has a larger diameter within, and it's going to be holding feces and also, again, absorbing. And then finally, we defecate or release feces through the anus. Now, along the path, you will have assistive organs, meaning that you'll have teeth, which is not really shown in this one, right? But teeth, we kind of all have an idea what teeth are, and they assist with the breakdown of nutrition coming through, right? They help mechanically break things down. You have your tongue, which does both chemical and also mechanical. Mechanical because you can move your tongue, you can move it, position your food underneath your teeth, break it down. But then we also have saliva, and that saliva produced by our salivary glands will then allow those molecules to melt onto the tongue, and then that tongue, all those flavors, all those tastes will go into the tongue, and then your body, right, will know that whatever you're ingesting is safe. Because taste has a lot to do with the properties of safety in a way, right? If something's delicious, it's probably gonna keep you alive, keep you healthy. But if something is very bitter, very like I don't know how to describe rotten, right? Bitter or sour, then you can expect that you're gonna spit it out, right? So taste is sort of making sure that you don't ingest anything you don't want to ingest. And then the liver, as we go down our esophagus, right, we're traveled through, we go to our stomach, and then the liver is going to play a role in that prep area. Remember how I said there's like a prep area for the small intestine? The liver is going to help with that. It's going to produce something we refer to as bile, and that bile is going to help with the absorption of fats. It's going to help us absorb fats the second that they make their way into the small intestines. And so the liver is responsible for doing that. We'll break that down. And then gallbladder is just a little storage for that bile. When bile is produced by the liver, it stores it in this little green pouch. And this little green pouch stores and concentrates bile, and then eventually it's also going to release it onto that little prep area. So we're going to talk about how the gallbladder and the liver really work together in digestive today. And then as we finish, we have our pancreas, which, good news, it also assists by secreting things into that prep station. So when we get out of the stomach, you got to understand that there's a lot of prep going to happen. It's going to be assisted by the liver, by the pancreas, and by the gallbladder. But luckily, it's not too bad. They prep everything in the small intestine, and we'll get into that. And so, as we look at all our systems that we sort of been going over in the last few weeks, we have oxygen and CO2 from the respiratory system, right? This is a capillary, a blood vessel. And I know we've only gone over the anatomy of blood vessels, but we haven't really gone over all the circulating blood vessels, which is today's topic. But this, when you look at it, is a blood vessel in the body, a capillary. And if we just look at just the system, you have oxygen flowing through, and if it arrives at a muscle cell, it arrives at a kidney, it arrives at a liver, then you can expect that it's going to, if in this instance, respiratory system is going to put oxygen into your bloodstream, and then you are going to release CO2 when you breathe out. So your capillaries are involved in the exchange of gas, and within your blood vessels, all those blood vessels that like us that flow through your body, they're all going to have blood carrying around oxygen and trying to carry CO2 back to the heart, back to the lungs, so that you can breathe it out. And if we look at just this red arrow now, this oxygen, once it's in the blood vessels, it's going to arrive at a muscle cell, it's going to arrive at an organ, and then it's going to provide that oxygen right to that tissue cell. And also that tissue cell, when it consumes or uses up that oxygen, it's then going to send out that CO2 as a waste. So it uses oxygen, poops out CO2, and where does it poop it out into? Right back into the blood vessels. And so if it produces its waste right back into the blood vessels, that CO2 will then make its way back to the lungs, and then you'll breathe it out. And this is again the respiratory system. And the digestive system is going to have that common parallel, that this is going to be a digestive organ. And as nutrients are being broken apart and being absorbed, when they are absorbed, they are placed inside of your blood vessels. And then your blood vessels will deliver those yummy nutrients all over to, if we follow our black arrow, back to these tissues. And so you can see how the cardiovascular system we've learned about in the last week plays a major role in the delivery of oxygen and CO2. And not just that, it's also going to allow for the things that were absorbed within the digestive tract to be delivered to the tissues. And then lastly, just to finish up, this is more going to be of an intro because this is more of next week's topic and the last next week's topic is that urinary system. What is it? What is the difference between urine and feces, right? Feces is produced by the digestive tract. Anything that's going through here that doesn't get digested or absorbed will eventually be released as feces. But what is urination? Urination, just at a glance right now, is that when your tissue cells, meaning this could be a muscle cell, it could be a muscle cell that we fed nutrients to here, like the biceps brachii, and then it's going to place its waste that it produced from consuming the nutrients. When it consumes those nutrients, it's going to produce a waste back into the blood vessels. And so you can see that if we feed the yummy nutrients to this muscle, it's going to place its waste back into the blood vessels. And then where does it go? It goes to the kidneys, which is not really shown. We have these organs here called the kidneys, and then that's going to filter your bloodstream, and then you produce urination. So it's worth talking about together so we can, because we all have the human experience that typically when we go produce our waste, we usually release these two at the same time, but the wastes are coming from two different things. Digestive or feces, again, is everything that didn't get absorbed in our digestive tract. Urination is getting rid of all the waste inside of your blood vessels that's produced by the tissues, that's produced by the nutrients that are being delivered to it by the digestive system. So you can see why it's important to sort of have examination on these three topics, or at least these three: digestive, respiratory, together with cardiovascular, because they all really tie together to serve and feed all the tissues you've learned about this semester in your body. And so let me get rid of all this noise and then we'll rewrite all of it. And so this is a nice little summary of the digestive tract. And do not forget that as you study for your lab exam, which is in 2 weeks, this exam is next week. So you can study for the lab exam at the same time. If you just, as you study these notes or even re-listen to this lecture, you have your lab notes and you're just finding a place for a lot of those terms because they all exist within the realm of these slides and your lab slides. And so when we look at our oral cavity, again, mechanical processing becomes the correct term to describe something being broken down with force, right, by friction. And then it's also moistening, which you can consider chemical, right? You're adding liquid or like moisture to it. And then it also has mucus and also has enzymes to help break down things. We'll keep it simple right now. They help break down things. You have enzymes that chemically can break down some of the food that you're eating before it's even made its way into your stomach. And so you can actually start chemically breaking them down with saliva. And our esophagus simply is just for the transport from the oral cavity to the stomach. And don't forget your pharynx. Your pharynx, the oral pharynx, is behind the oral cavity. And then the pharynx is just a common name for the throat. It links the nasal cavity, it links the oral cavity, and it links the larynx. And then so the pharynx takes up this whole space. And when you ingest things through the oral cavity, it'll go straight down into your esophagus, a muscular tube, which is going to send everything down to your stomach. The stomach is most famously known for its chemical breakdown because it uses hydrochloric acid. And then there's mechanical processing because this organ, you have to imagine to yourself, I know we've all seen those trucks that are carrying cement. And then they're always rotating around, rotating that cement so it doesn't solidify. In this instance, it's not rotating, but it is in a sense like squeezing. It is pushing down forward towards the end of the digestive tract. It's pushing it down this direction, and it's sort of causing these rounded forms of contractions with the smooth muscle in order to churn that food with hydrochloric acid. And so you can see why it still is designated with the ability to do mechanical processing, because now we're really even learning what smooth muscle really does around the body. We've seen smooth muscles in small examples. Last week we saw cardiac muscle that acts on the heart, but when it comes to the digestive tract, we're dealing with smooth muscle. And so this muscle begins up here. Right about here, you've all almost ingested something and you're like, oh, wait, I don't want to eat this. And then so before you ingest it, you're sort of able to what's the word? Retch it out, force it out. And so that happens about here, because here we have some skeletal muscles here. But the second we become, I would say like 2/3 of the esophagus, we become smooth muscle. If you make it to a certain point, even all of us sort of know that if you swallow something, it's about here, there's no way it's coming back, right? And then so this will eventually lead anything that you're ingesting into the stomach. And the stomach's mechanical processing is also done by smooth muscles, as we're going to see a little bit more in detail in a sec. Finally, the small intestine, again, we're seeing enzymes, so it has some chemical breakdown, so it breaks things down through the act of enzymes, and this is where absorption occurs. This is what's going to place all those nutrients into the blood vessels, circulate it through the body, and feed any muscle, feed the organs through the capillaries, right? It's going to flow through the blood, and all these organs get their nutrients after the small intestine has placed them in the capillaries. Finally, we have a large intestine, which is going to be involved in, again, dehydrating our feces. In other words, removing the water and then allowing that water to recirculate if necessary. And then not just that, we see compaction. It's capable of you to store that feces for long term in case you really do need that water. You never know what we are in a very civilized society, but back when our ancestors were traveling around, they never really knew if they were going to have water, or if they were a very nomadic people. And so containing feces was sort of an extra way of storing water for a certain amount of time, because we can just absorb from it as necessary. And we'll talk about all that in a second. All right, next. And so now we can see some functions. Now we're drawing our functions, and we're sort of already seen a little piece of all of these when we went over these organs. But just to quickly define what these functions are, simply, ingestion is the act of consuming. That's it. Whether it's solid food or liquids, that's all ingesting is. Mechanical digestion is that ability to crush. It could be teeth, it could be the stomach turning and churning. And so you can see it doesn't matter, as long as there's some force on that, anything you consumed, whether it's like contractions of smooth muscle, breakdown from your teeth, dissolving from your using your tongue to break things down, all of it will be considered mechanical. But if it's going to be involving enzymes, or it's going to be involving chemicals like hydrochloric acid is the easiest example. If it's going to be involving any of these two things, it's considered chemical digestion. Chemical digestion. And then secretion. This one's a little bit easier to understand if we just think about Pavlov and the dog, right? When you put food in front of a dog, what does it start doing? It starts drooling, right? So our salivary glands, these salivary glands that we see in our oral cavity, these are involved in the secreting of things that are in water that will help break things down, like enzymes. And then there'll also be, again, the stomach secretes acids. We're going to see that the small intestine secrete buffers, and even if you haven't taken chemistry, buffers just helps with the resistance in pH changes. which means that if I add, we all kind of have an idea what acid is. And if I have a cup of water and then I put acid in there, you can expect that that water, whatever's in that bottle, is now going to become very acidic, and it can burn through, it can break things down. It's acidic. But if I have in that water bottle and I add something that's just another more molecules that we consider a buffer, if I add a buffer in there and I add acid to it, the pH doesn't change. I add more acid, the pH doesn't change. So buffers in themselves, they resist pH changes. So that has to make sense to you, right? Because if we have hydrochloric acid, which is something with a pH of approximately around 2.35 or 2.75 in the stomach, that is incredibly dangerously acidic. And again, if it goes into your small intestine without being neutralized, you will digest your own organs. And so we release buffers right before that. Right after we get out of the stomach, buffers are released by the pancreas in order to neutralize that acid. But we'll see that a little bit more with better pictures in a second. And then sometimes your digestive tract, again, can release salts, but this would be a topic that we're not really going to touch on. And then finally, accessory digestive organs. There is a difference between the main players of the passage of food from oral cavity, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine. All of these are the major passageways that food will encounter. And along the way, they have assistance from your accessory organs. And so that's going to be your teeth, tongue, salivary glands, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. And so we can see that secretion is going to be done by some of those accessories. For example, the liver, I mentioned that it secretes something we call bile, we'll see in a second, and stores that bile in the gallbladder. The liver itself is even considered the largest gland in your body. It's not even considered much of an organ, but more the gland more than anything. And then absorption. This one's going to be probably that's the main nitty gritty of like digestive, right? Is you're taking things from the external environment and then you are absorbing them into your blood vessels through the intestines, whether it's small or large. You're just absorbing different things into the bloodstream. We'll go into that detail in a sec. And then defecation is going to be that last action of releasing anything that was indigestible and you were not able to break it apart, and then we call that feces. And so, let's get rid of this. All right. Now, as we move into this segment of anatomy, you want to stay organized. You are learning 4 things here. Only 4 things. Do not allow yourselves to be overwhelmed by this segment because it can be overwhelming if you don't organize your thinking around this. Every single organ in your body comprises of layers. You have already learned this. You just haven't learned it in a complete summary. So for example, the first bit of tissue you encounter, if you're traveling through the lumen of anything, the first thing that you encounter, if we're food, we're a little piece of particle, right? We've entered the digestive tract. We're inside that giant worm that is our digestive tract. What do we see around us? We see a family of tissue, a type of tissue that serves as the inner lining and the outer lining of things, epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue is going to be our first layer we call mucosa. We've learned that epithelial tissue typically has little cells that help and secrete mucus. In respiratory, we saw that as well, that there is a layer, the epithelial tissue secretes mucus because it has goblet cells as an example, hence why all the first layer, the epithelial tissue, doesn't matter whether it's columnar cells, doesn't matter whether it's pseudostratified columnar cells. Mucosa is a reference to the first layer, which is the epithelial layer, right? We're looking at a 4-layered burrito here, right? The first one here is your mucosa. The second layer, you even know what it is. Submucosa is going to have connective tissue. Remember, we always had epithelial tissue, and then we had a boundary called the basement membrane. And then we had connective tissue at the bottom, typically areolar tissue. And then that areolar tissue allowed blood vessels to innervate because epithelial cells need to get the nutrients, they need to get gases to feed themselves. And then now we're learning about our next layer, which is very easy, our muscular layer. Our muscular layer is going to possess the muscles necessary to passage things. You can see that there's two layers here. That's a unique thing about the digestive tract. It has two layers of muscles. And so as food or nutrients are passing through the small intestine, for example, if you imagine your toothpaste this morning, that when you squeezed out your toothpaste, you sort of had to push it out. Your muscles are capable of doing two things. They push in this direction, and they also allow for sort of a segmentation of breaking of the food as it's passaging through, sort of squeezing in a circular manner, and also sort of sliding along the tube in order to passage it. And so you're seeing smooth muscle exist. So you're seeing all different classes of tissues, right? Epithelial was the outer surface tissues. Connective tissue brought in and allowed a lot of other surface, a lot of structures to come in and serve these areas, like blood connective tissue, like blood vessels, capillaries. And then finally, this smooth muscle layer allows for contraction. And then finally, we got to organize it, right? All these organs, when we look at a digestive tract, all of these organs are not swimming around, right? As you're running around, your liver isn't bouncing around and clashing with this part of your small intestine. The small intestine isn't getting tangled up with the small intestine. Sorry, the large and the small intestine are getting tangled up. There's an organization to it, and that's what the serosa is for. It's to ensure that your organs are anchored to the body walls, to other organs. They're just making sure that things are being anchored together. And so learn these layers, and then now let's describe them. Mucosa, inner lining. It is going to be made up of the epithelial cells. This can be columnar cells, could be cuboidal cells, could be pseudostratified. The word mucosa, no matter what organ you're looking at, refers to the epithelia. Where it's relevant, and I'm going to go ahead and just go to segue to it anyways, is that this was your respiratory notes from last week. And if we looked at the inner lining, all of the inner lining of any segment is typically considered mucosa. That's why you can even see respiratory mucosa. And then if we look at the mucosa layer, the inner layer of this area, the pharynx, this was considered again that throat area. And the mucosa layer is made out of stratified squamous epithelia. And so you see, as your vocab expands, it's easier to talk about these things because now the respiratory mucosa inside of your larynx and inside of the trachea has changed. And then as we keep going through this tree, you can see that we change once more, we change one more time. But again, never forget mucosa is always a reference to the epithelial lining. And then underneath, recall this little lining underneath was always the basement membrane. And then underneath, we always had connective tissue. And in this instance now, we are changing our vocabulary to submucosa. When we looked at submucosa, it was always consisting of connective tissue. It's just always going to be a different one. You just don't know which one you're going to get. And typically, you only know which one you're going to get if you know the function of the organ. And in this instance, we have a submucosa made out of irregular connective tissue because irregular had that benefit that it had elasticity. We saw it under the skin. That's why we can pull our skin and it won't rip off. I know if you're looking at this video, you're not being able to see this, but if you pull skin, you can see it doesn't rip off and it's capable of just returning back to its shape. Reason being is that you have irregular connective tissue allowing it to retain its shape even after a little bit stretching. So it sort of has a little bit of an elasticity. And so the submucosa needs to be a little bit elastic because as things are traveling through your digestive tract, you really don't know how, as things are being ingested, you sort of need a little bit of expansion. So that submucosa allows for it. And it allows for blood vessels and even some mucus glands, as we're seeing here, as I'm trying to circle, yes, these secrete mucus onto that layer. And so you can expect that this inner lining will also have a very consistent texture of mucus all over it. And as we move on, blood vessels, it has to make sense to us, right, that we have blood vessels in those regions, because as these yummy nutrients are passing through here and being absorbed, right, they are entering and going into our blood vessels and then being delivered into our blood vessels. We are going to learn mesenteric artery and vein today. And what a mesentery is, this is a perfect example to see it, it'll save us some time, is that mesentery is a connective tissue that pretty much just keeps everything anchored together. It allows blood vessels to go through it, and we even name the arteries that are going to sort of innervate, meaning that they're going to be sort of anchored to the organs by the mesentery. This mesentery is made out of mesothelia. We've seen this word before. Mesothelia makes up cavities, right? Body wall cavities like the pericardial cavity, the pleural cavity. All of them are made out of a simple squamous mesothelia. And then we have areolar tissue and more mesothelia. So mesentery pretty much is a play off of the word mesothelia. It's like a sandwich of mesothelia, which is a word that should remind us when we learned about in tissues, and I'm going to go back to it anyways. If we look at our tissue notes, I'm going to get rid of this for next semester, is if we look at this segment, mesothelia was an example of nothing but simple squamous cells. Mesothelia. And so this is just a simple layer of cells, simple squamous, a little sandwich of it, with a little bit of areolar tissue and a little bit of fat cells we're seeing in there, right? And so again, mesentery allows blood vessels to go and serve the organ and allows for even nerves to go and serve the organs. We're going to see that it also provides for lymphatic vessels, but that's for your take-home segment. And it's only going to be a very small segment, but lymphatics is going to absorb any, it's going to be involved in immunity as we're ingesting things, and it helps with the absorptions of fats. But that's going to be a complication for when we talk about that segment. Anything else to add? And this segment will also have exocrine glands. Exocrine glands. Remember, exocrine glands are like sweat glands, anything that secretes right into that space. And so the submucosa, one easy example right now, is that you can see it has a little mucus gland. And that little mucus gland is going to secrete mucus right there. It's not going to place mucus into the bloodstream, because if it did that, if it placed anything in the bloodstream, it would be endocrine secretions. But if it's secreting it just right there onto the surface, it's exocrine glands. And then we have our muscular layer, and in the digestive tract, it's a little more complicated because you have two layers, one that goes in a circular layer and one that goes in a longitudinal layer. And it's easy to hold on to. If you think about what the digestive tract has to do, is that it has to, as things are passaging through, these muscles have to contract in a manner to squeeze in this manner, sort of a circular manner. And then it also has to push things along the whole pathway, right? It has to send it through that whole giant worm. So one will be squeezing to break it down in a circular manner, and then one will be breaking it down to go in a long ways, right? To send it the long direction. Longitudinal. And this passage or this movement or this contraction of smooth muscle is considered as mechanical processing, and again, it's helping moving it along that digestive tract. And then finally, serosa is just going to be the layer that when you look at an organ itself, if you take it out, the first thing you see is going to be the serosa. It's going to be the outer layer. And so it's going to ensure that things are being anchored to the abdominal cavity. And just as a simple note, there is no serosa in our oral cavity, in our throat, esophagus, or the rectum. These are the parts that do not have it. Instead, they are called adventitia, which in your heads, you could think about it to yourself. I either have serosa or I have adventitia. And so which organs have adventitia and which organs have serosa becomes important on this little segment. Is you want to make sure that instead of calling the outer layer of these, you can call the first layer mucosa. You can call the second layer submucosa. You can call the third layer, if it exists, if it has muscles, you would call it the muscular layer. But the one thing that they do have is that you change the name to adventitia instead of serosa. That's the big difference there. And lastly, mesentery. Mesentery is going to be a peritoneal membrane. If you already, even in some way, you already know what this is. When we discussed our pericardial cavity, I'm going to quickly go back to those notes. When we discussed our pericardial cavity, remember we had our little extra credit activity. When we looked at our pericardial cavity, we had this little space on the inside that had serous fluid. This is the same membrane that we are encountering right now when we talk about mesentery. The peritoneal membrane is the same thing as these layers of walls. Remember that we talked about visceral, we talked about parietal. The outer layer is the parietal layer. The inner layer is called the visceral layer. All the organs of digestion have this same organization. They have a layer on the outside, a layer on the inside. And you can see why we're even seeing some of these words come back. I'm not seeing it on this one at the very moment. Longitudinal, I saw it a second ago. Let me quickly look for it. Here, we see that the layer of visceral peritoneum, meaning that the inner wall, the wall in contact with the organs, is also made out of mesothelia, just like the one from the pericardial cavity, just like the pleural cavity made out of mesothelia. It's going to be the wall in contact with the organ, right? The visceral peritoneal. There's one more wall not shown, which is your parietal one. And again, you're going to have serous fluid flowing through them, because if you have muscle contractions, you need to have a cavity just like the heart does, just like respiratory also did when we saw how it sits within the cavity, the thoracic cavity. Oh, wrong way, sorry. Right. The heck, where is it? We had a picture of it and I cannot find it. Oh, here. And so we saw that even our lungs, they had a visceral pleura and a parietal pleura, and it was the wall that was next to the organ, and then you have the wall that's in contact with the cavity, and then inside you have serous fluid. So hopefully you're seeing a theme, is that every organ will always typically have a serous cavity, a cavity that has serous fluid. There'll always be a wall that's in contact with the organ, always designated visceral. There'll be a wall that's typically called parietal because it's away, the outside of that cavity. And you just adjust the name. If you're the heart, you're a pericardium. If you're around the lungs, you're called a pleura. So hopefully this serves as a nice little review for that, or help you understand that a little bit better. But you have the same thing going on with this, even though we don't have a great illustration for it. The wall in contact is going to be the visceral peritoneum, and you can expect that the wall away is going to be called the parietal peritoneum. And all of them have been made out of mesothelium, which is a simple squamous tissue. Mesentery is defined typically as a tissue that provides access for blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatics. And I know we may not know what lymphatics are just quite yet. And again, all our organs are not just flowing and sloshing around inside your stomach like a bowl of soup. They are completely anchored. And so the mesentery is what keeps things anchored and connected in your digestive system. Now, your digestive tract. We've seen our... Oh, this is the picture I wanted to apply so I didn't have to go back to the other pictures. So this is just a little reminder picture. Remember, epithelial tissues, and then we have basement membrane, and then we have connective tissue on the bottom. I put this picture here so I wouldn't have to be swapping between slides, and I completely forgot. Okay, and so with that. Now, the mucous epithelium, again, is going to be the first thing that your food is in contact with. the mucosa layer. The connective tissue layer would be the submucosa layer, right? The submucosa. And so right now, as we progress down, we're seeing everything occurring, or what's occurring in our digestive tract and the functions being applied to this segment. So we know ingestion is taking food into your system. We need to add a little bit more complication, in that. When you ingest anything, the second that you place food in your mouth, it is no longer called food, it is called bolus. Bolus. It is the technical term to apply to everything that you have ingested and is being passaged down until you get to your stomach. When you get to your stomach, it is no longer called bolus, it is called chyme, spelled with a CH, chyme. And so that same bolus, though, that's what makes this a little bit complicated, is that this bolus is just the name of whatever you ingest, but the second it gets mixed with your hydrochloric acid, it becomes chyme. All right? And so we ingest our bolus, we do mechanical breakdown in the mouth. It'll be passaged through the pharynx and then be sent down through the esophagus and then finally into the stomach. And as getting into the stomach and the small intestine, we have mechanical breakdown. Mouth was easy, right? Chewing. Stomach is easy because we're churning, we're mixing it with the acid. And then we're going through the small intestines, and those smooth muscle contractions will eventually help with churning that food, segmenting that food. And so that segmentation or breaking that food down will be happening in the small intestine. So you're seeing our examples of mechanical breakdown leading into the large intestine. Digestion itself is when we are not just breaking it down, but remember, it's breaking down and then finally absorbing. And so you can see that the breakdown and absorbing occurs together after the stomach, because in the stomach you are breaking things down, but you don't actually absorb anything into your blood vessels in your stomach. You are absorbing things into your blood vessels when in the small intestine. And so the act of digestion, you can see, is sort of indicated here a little bit right after the stomach, because this is where we begin to break it down, neutralize the acid, and then we are mixing it, and it is just finally being absorbed into our blood vessels. Our blood vessels will take it in and then distribute all those yummy nutrients that you absorbed to all those vital organs and those muscles around the body, which technically muscles are organs. I just always like to distinguish between the two. But it's going to deliver all those yummy nutrients through the blood vessels. And then whatever you could not absorb will go into the large intestine. You're going to have just a storage of feces, but it'll still have the ability to, you'll still have something to absorb from it, essentially water and salts. And then finally, we will release that feces, and then that is the act of defecation. So this is a nice little image I found that has to, it sums up these two pictures together. It sums up the major organs of digestion and where things occur. And I really like it as a little bit of a flow chart to help you sort of a mental model to hold on to these things. The last thing we need to discuss is the movement around things, right? When you have your bolus, when you ingest it and you passage it into your esophagus, swallowing. And then peristalsis, this is the technical term when we have smooth muscle contractions. Whenever we have smooth muscles, contracting and passaging food all the way down from the esophagus down to the large intestine, that movement is created by smooth muscle contractions, that movement along the digestive tract. And I'm putting this little line to remind you, it goes in an arrow, it goes in an order. Peristalsis really simply is the movement of food through this digestive tract. Peristalsis. And along the way, the mucosal layer, the layer within it changes. In the stomach, you're going to have different types of cells. You're going to have columnar cells that are going to be responsible for secreting things like enzymes, secreting acid. And then, but when we get to, say, the small intestine, you're also going to have columnar cells, but these columnar cells might be slightly different. The columnar cells in the small intestines, they absorb things. So what structures can we expect on our columnar cells if they're going to be absorbing things in the small intestine? Microvilli, right? Microvilli absorb things. They absorb things. So you're not really going to see columnar cells in your stomach with microvilli. There's no point because you're not going to do any absorbing there. But they're going to be secreting things. So they may not have microvilli, but they will be secreting things from their apical side, from their plasma membrane. So the microvilli will be only, so that's what really changes here. That's the hard part about digestive when you go into complexities in the digestive tract, is that every single inner lining will be called mucosa. But the mucosa is different in the stomach. It's different in the small intestine. It's different in the large intestine. It's different in the anus. It was different in the oral cavity. But it doesn't matter. You call that first inner lining mucosa. And that's what makes, if you've understood me so far and that doesn't seem that complicated to you, trust me when I tell you you've learned it miles above the way it's being taught anywhere else. It's just mucosa is going to be that inner lining. It could be any of those epithelial tissues that you've learned about. It doesn't matter. It could be columnar cells, cuboidal cells, squamous cells, but it just is a reference to the epithelial cells you encounter before we hit that basement membrane. All right. And so as we segue into these slides now, you'll see that what we're going to care about is that we're going to sort of explore a little bit about a few of these layers. Like we have the muscular layer up top here, and then we have the mucosa layers. So we're still learning more of the same and just adding a little bit more concepts. So this is the same image as before. And what I want to draw your eyes to is I want you to draw your eyes to this little green arrow, and you'll see these little knobs here. And those little knobs, again, were these little folds. Now, if we zoom in on it, we're exploring more of what we already know. This little segment here, this is what your food, your chyme would be in contact with as it's traveling through your small intestine. That you would have the epithelial layer, meaning that you're going to have columnar cells on this layer. Let's see, is there a zoomed up image? Yes. This epithelial layer is going to be exactly what you're seeing right here. This segment, really hard to see, but these cells, these simple columnar cells with microvilli, that's what we're seeing right here. You're seeing nothing but a bunch of those little rectangular cells here on the surface. That's all. And so, epithelial layer. That's what's in your mucosal layer, components of the mucosa. If we look at the epithelial layer, these columnar cells organize themselves on the surface in a very unique manner, creating sort of like brushes, like little brushes of little absorbing cells. These little brushes are called villi. And so these villi, they're going to be in contact with your nutrients as they're traveling through, and as they brush through, they're going to be absorbed. They're going to be absorbing those nutrients, and where are they absorbing them into? The capillaries. And this next layer here is your lamina propria. Lamina propria is a word to describe another form of connective tissue, typically areolar connective tissue. And what these little brushes do is that they allow for absorption. They increase surface area so that things can be absorbed in these spaces, flow, stay there, and as the muscles are contracting, you're just, all the food that's passaging through your system is being just going through a gauntlet of absorption by passaging through all of this. all of this and just being in contact with the villi, and it is absorbing all of those nutrients. And its long-term goal is to passage those nutrients into the submucosa layer. If we draw our eyes to the label, submucosa, you can see it's going to be the underlying connective tissue that exists underneath that mucosal layer. And there is another muscle that's not really described heavily or much, but this muscle exists in just the mucosa. It is not the same thing as the muscular layer, right? We learned the muscular layer has two, a circular one and a longitudinal one, but these are more superficial, right? This is deep. This is in contact. We're traveling through the lumen, through the passageway in your small intestine. And so these nutrients are being absorbed and they are being placed in the submucosa, where the capillaries will take those yummy nutrients and then deliver it to the rest of the body eventually. And then if we go a little bit further, let me finish one last thing. So this area was your submucosa. And then you can see your mucosa layer is going to be the most outer layer, consisting of these components: epithelial layer, villi, lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa. Make sure we know the components of the mucosa. This will be a simple, these are components of mucosa, muscular layer, submucosa, right? Just a simple multiple choice type of style of examination of knowing where these property, or what each one is composed of. And if we look at our submucosal layer, we see that we have connective tissue. We saw that we had irregular, in the instance for most of these, irregular connective tissue. And that irregular connective tissue is going to harbor the blood vessels. And now as we look at these diagrams, green. This is new for us, lymphatics. This is the next chapter we cover. But lymphatics regulates liquid volume. And it also is involved in immunity. And doesn't it make sense, as you ingest things, if they didn't get destroyed in your stomach acid, that as you're passaging, and if you absorb anything dangerous, you have the ability to defend yourself. And that's what these lymphatic vessels are really there for, is to regulate blood volume, or volume of liquid in your body. More on that later. And also in immunity. And so these yellow ones are going to be nerves, because remember, the smooth muscles, even though you can't control it, right? Skeletal muscle, you're controlling it. But smooth muscle, if I want to passage my breakfast this morning, which I didn't have breakfast this morning, but if I was passaging it right now, right, your smooth muscles, if you want to digest your breakfast right now, your snacks, go ahead, do it, right? You can't do it. It's still under the control of your brain, but it's under the control of the autonomic parts of your head, the parts of your head that take care of the things that you don't want to be worrying about. And so the circular and longitudinal muscles are muscles that are contracting, but they are not under our voluntary control. They are involuntary. And you have two, circular layer and longitudinal layer. There is one exception to that rule, and we'll talk about it when we get there. And then lastly, we have our serosa. Our serosa is the outer layer of the organ, which is going to keep us attached to our body cavities. And then the mesentery is probably going to sit right on top. Now there's this word here called myenteric plexus. This myo, sort of a play off of the word entero and myo, and simply speaking, it's the one that sends the commands or the controls, or it's what's keeping track of what's flowing through your digestive tract, and it's nervous tissue. This is nervous tissue that has made its way, or it's connected to more than likely, your medulla oblongata, and then in your pons, and making sure that we're capable of doing smooth muscle contraction. And so the myenteric plexus, what you just need to know is that it's what's sending the signals for contraction. And that's what this image segues here, this image here, is that we have a myenteric plexus. Plexus means branching, and it's located in the external muscular layers between the circular and the longitudinal layers. In other words, it's sandwiched between these two layers. You're seeing the myenteric plexus right here. sandwiched between both layers. And it's what gives, again, the local control for digestive activities. And here you see just a nice little image of, if you're here in the small intestine, here's our mucosa, inner lining. And then we have our submucosa, which has blood vessels, lymphatic vessels. And then we have our muscular layers, which will be like, let's say this is our two muscular layers. And then right in between, you would have your myenteric plexus. You would have this structure here. Here we're seeing our smooth muscles, and then we're seeing our myenteric plexus anchored in between. And you can see that it sends a signal. Once it sends a signal for contraction, that signal will depolarize all of these cells, causing all of them to contract all sort of in unison. But the signal's received from our myenteric plexus. And then the last thing to add, that myenteric plexus commands our muscles. So we have two muscles. We have our circular muscles, longitudinal muscles. So if you look at this image, what you're looking at is that if you're looking at this particular one, you're looking at cells coming right at you. Like if you think about this pen that I have in my hand, right now, the image right now in focus is something coming straight at you, like this pen looking straight at you, a muscle coming straight at you. And think about what it's doing. If we make this huge tube right now, like a circular motion, like this is a tube, like a circle here, this is your digestive tract. One circular muscle is going to be going straight at you. You're looking at a muscle going straight at you. And now if we look at one in this direction, it's going straight at you this way. So let's do it this one first. If this is the passageway of a small intestine, things are flowing through it, you have a muscle that circles around it just like this tape, right? The direction is like this, all the way around. So when you look at this slide, it's like they made a section of it, and you're looking at one that goes in a circular manner, and it's going straight at us, and then gonna circle around, and then circle around all the way back to come and stare back at us again. If you look at the longitudinal one, it's going long ways. So things need to go, not only do they need to be like squeezed, like contracted like this, circular ones do this along the entire digestive tract. But the longitudinal ones, they're making sure that things are going in that direction. So they're sort of pushing in a way that's sort of making sure that things go in that direction. Pushing in that direction, a long ways. And so their fiber orientation is different. The fiber orientation of these is coming straight at you. This one, you're seeing the same muscles going in a different direction. They're going long ways in a longitudinal direction. And so that's what we mean by the two layers. And so sometimes these layers are just called the inner and outer layer, which makes it kind of easy. And the circular one will be the inner one. The longitudinal one will be the outer. And this definition, alter shape of lumen. Remember that lumen is a passageway of substances, meaning that if we're looking at this picture, anything going through this space is in the lumen. The lumen is inside the tube. Inside the tube. And then the last thing. There's a unique structure created from these smooth muscles. If you look at all of this, you'll notice that there's this consistent folding, right? And then it eventually makes a complete circle. You can even sort of see an indentation of that circle here. Another one here, 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 another one here. And those are called circular folds. And they result from the actual shape of these muscles. And they're, yes, we'll just leave it at that. This is a nice way to study. I don't know if any of you are good at like writing, but I feel like this is a good way to sum up everything. If you can do this without your notes, I think this will be very useful. And if you complete these, email me these, and I can totally check these for you. And that, I think that's a good little activity to do when you get a chance. Oh, what did I just do? Okay, I'll leave this up. All right. Oh, no. Okay. And now, peristalsis. More of the same. Peristalsis is the name given to the wave of muscle contraction. This is a reminder that food that enters your digestive tract, the second that you've consumed it and it's made contact with your saliva and it's become a moist mass, it becomes a bolus. This bolus is going to be propelled along the digestive tract through, again, these muscle contractions, and that's going to be referred to as peristalsis. And so you can see at a glance, you have from mouth towards anus. Here, your food bolus wants to go all the way down there, so it's going to rely on our muscles. And so recall, we have two layers of muscles. We have our circular one, and then we have our longitudinal one, that second one. And so our muscles contract in a manner that allow that bolus to move forward. So what we see is that the circular muscles will contract behind the bolus, sort of like pushing out toothpaste out of a little bottle. And then the longitudinal boluses will contract. They will contract and look at their arrows. They look at the arrow direction here. Look at the arrow direction. And that contraction direction of the longitudinals and the circulars together cause this fold to move forward. So it's pushing back, and this one's pushing up into the lumen. So into the lumen, this one's pushing back. And so they create what you would sort of imagine when you're trying to squeeze toothpaste out of a bottle. So this one's pushing back, this one's pushing down, and then they cause those two muscles contracting, push our bolus forward. Now, this segment, I have some letterings here. Now, what occurs as a result of peristalsis is something we call segmentation. And this is when we start churning. Remember how I keep talking about that cement mixer? You see those trucks with the cement rolling over and over? That's what you sort of have to imagine is going on inside of your digestive tract. So that's why we have churn and fragment the bolus. And so if we get into that now, let's say you ingested your meal, and as it's passaging through, remember, this is a very easy image, right? Because it's only one little piece of bolus. But this is reflects more of what you're going to get, right? You're consuming consistently, or the whole meal is going through your system, not just one bite. And so if we look at this segment, you can see we start A, B, and C, right? Separate segments. And so this form of contraction, what it does is something called segmentation, meaning mixing. So you see we start off with a little bit of A here, a little bit of B there, and through the muscle contractions, you can see that a little bit of C mixed with B, a little bit of B mixed with A, right? B mixed with A, a little bit of A with whatever this was. I just designated 1 because I didn't think it through, but otherwise 1A mixed with 1, you can see it's just mixing. 1 with 2, you can see that there's just segmentation. And that's all there is to it. That's what segmenting is the fact that you're churning and mixing your bolus. And in more than likely it's probably chyme at this point, so it's kind of should have been written as chyme. But it's okay. Whatever we have here is fine. Yeah, see, it occurs in most areas of small intestine. So if we're in the small intestine, we have become chyme. So this doesn't make too much sense because we don't really get a lot of segmentation in our esophagus. So this more than likely should have been switched over to chyme. But we'll leave it as both. So I'll just include both if I ask it. And that's really it. And again, what causes these smooth muscle contractions? It's going to be our myenteric plexus that we just learned about. And to finish up our lecture, we're just going to talk about the details on a few of these organs, because some of them are special, unique, and we have to address them. Now, this is going to be the sort of what I consider the easy part. It's just actually knowing the structure names of things. And so the cheeks are going to be the lateral walls of our oral cavity. They contain little pads of fat, and they also have our buccinator muscle. It's the muscle involved in compression of the cheeks or sucking. Remember that one? And so buccinator. And when we look at we've heard this word before. Labia means lips, and so we have our two lips, and I'm only seeing one labeled for some reason, but okay. And so the lips form your anterior boundary, right? Meaning that the anterior boundary, the boundary that's the most front of the oral cavity. And so your lips, or labia, is going to be the technical term for your lips. Your tongue, which is held by a muscle here called genioglossus, you're able to control it. And so your tongue is where your taste buds are at. We sort of already talked about our tongue when we talked about senses. And so these are muscles involved in the control, but in your particular segment, you don't go over these. But geniohyoid is a muscle that's going to connect to your hyoid bone and connect to the mandible. And then you have your mylohyoid, which is the floor of your mouth. And the only thing I really want you to pull from this, really, is that the floor of your mouth is made by muscles. The bottom, the inferior portion of your oral cavity, is made out of muscles. If you looked at your mandible, if you saw it without any muscles, you can actually put your finger right through and touch the roof of your mouth. So this part is made out of muscle. The inferior boundary is made out of muscle. And then our superior boundary, this one's not going to be new to us. We have where our palatine bone was. This is where our maxilla bone was, and this little one was our palatine bone. And so the entire thing is called your palate. You know how they always say when you're tasting stuff, your palate to taste, right? Palate is a reference to the mouth. And so palate is going to refer to this superior boundary. You have a hard palate and a soft palate. The hard palate is going to be the portion if you touch the roof of your tongue. The roof of your mouth, and you with your tongue, and you feel it. You can feel it's really hard, right? Really hard, really hard. And then eventually, if you drag your tongue to the back, you feel that very soft part. That very soft part is called your soft palate. And your soft palate prevents things from entering your nasal cavity, or as you're ingesting food, it prevents it from going into your nasal cavity. The posterior boundary is going to have a structure we refer to as your uvula. Your uvula is going to be hanging from that soft palate. It's that thing that when you look in the mirror and you look into that little hanging bell that vibrates when you talk, that's going to be your uvula. Now, if this is called your palatine bone that makes your palate so hard and soft, then you can see that we have our palatine tonsil, which is going to be close to that palatine bone, or that hard palate, pardon. And so palatine tonsil. This is a bit of lymphatic. So this is that last bit of segment that we need to talk about in your asynchronous portion that I'm going to give you for lymphatics. And then the root of the tongue is simply different from the body, because the body of the tongue is the major mass of the tongue. But the root is sort of like what you would imagine anything being called a root is. It's sort of the segment where it's anchored in a way, sort of the bottom and the base of it, where it's anchored, I think is the safest way to think about it. Lingual, lengua, like tacos de lengua, right? We've all had those, like tongue tacos. Lingual is a reference to the tongue. And so lingual tonsil is going to sit underneath the tongue. Now, all tonsils, we're going to see, are involved in immunity. As you are ingesting things, there's little cells here patrolling, which we'll get into the nitty-gritty of that a little bit later in your lymphatics lecture. But they're just making sure patrolling. And that's why if you have overactive tonsils, they have to remove them, because what they're doing is that they're trying to protect you from it. They think they found something dangerous or foreign. And so they trigger an immune response, and that's why you feel sick. They're doing that to protect you. And this was some question that somebody asked in class. And with that, tonsils, and that's it. So this just becomes a very simple ID, be able to ID those structures. Teeth, very quickly, when we look at our total counts, we have 32 total permanent teeth. 32 total permanent teeth. When we are kids, babies, we have what we refer to as deciduous teeth. These are, we also know them as primary teeth, milk teeth, or baby teeth. I think baby teeth is the most common one. And so these teeth are going to be the ones that we have that we lose as children, and then we develop our adult teeth. When you look at let's start with deciduous. When we look at our teeth, we'll see that at the very anterior portion, we have incisors, like scissors, right? They're cutting teeth. They're meant to cut. And so we have incisors, some that are central, some that go more lateral. So central, lateral. And then we have the ones that look like fangs, right? Like vampire teeth. Those are our canines. And then as we go back, we have some that are meant for grinding, which we just call molar teeth. Molars are the ones meant for grinding. So you can see that you have them at the very top. You have them on the bottom and at the top in the same proportion. 2 centrals, 2 laterals, 2 canines, 2 molars, first molars, and 2 second molars. When we look at adult teeth, not much changes. 2 central incisors, 2 lateral, and then 2 canine. And then we have our premolar and second premolar, and then our first molar and our second molar. And then we have our wisdom teeth that might have to be removed in some of us because they may be growing on top of the second and first molar, or they may come out too much into the posterior side. But otherwise, why we have wisdom teeth is that you have to recall that in nature, back in our ancestors didn't have toothpaste, toothbrushes. They didn't even know what bacteria was. They also didn't have extraneous, sugar diets, what ruins teeth, what gives cavities and just destroys teeth. And they typically had a high diet of fats. And if you think about that for a second, we've always considered ourselves as humans that we were predominantly hunters and meats, and that's partly true. The success of the human brain came from the excessive ability to consume a lot of protein, a lot of fats. But before that, we were already developing our brains with high fat content because we had a high nut diet. We were one of the first, like it shows like that. We migrated according to diet, and basically we were looking for places with high fruit, high nuts. And so that means a lot of cracking, a lot of breaking of nuts. And so these wisdom teeth are sort of backup teeth. And also humans live a lot longer than our ancestors did, like living up to a good age of 30 is good. Like chimpanzees now can live up to 60 and 65 in nature, which is kind of new thing that's occurring, with human protection. And so we never really lived that long. We had predators, crazy temperatures. And so the wisdom teeth would last you until your adulthood, maybe like roughly around 30-ish. And you would be fine as a wild man, women, like surviving and cracking nuts, and you had backup teeth. And so now, though, we take such good care of our teeth that the wisdom teeth have to be sort of removed because we really take care of our teeth good enough that, throughout your lifespan that you really don't need them. So they're considered a vestigial component of the body. But still, they are counted as permanent teeth. Anything else I want to add here? No, this is extra, and I don't have the images for it. And then I do have the images. All right, so let's keep it going. So when we look at this image, we have ligaments that keep it attached. We have the periodontal and the roots. And so let's go to that picture. You can see that your tooth anchored into the socket of the bone. You have your periodontal ligaments, are all these little tiny ones here, keeping it anchored together. And you can see that your tooth itself has segments to it. The top portion is called the crown. So you may have heard some people, I got to get my crown replaced. It means they got to replace the superior portion of that tooth. Then you have your neck where your gingiva is, where your gum is. Gingiva is the technical word for gum. That's why if you have inflammation of your gums, it's called gingivitis. And then you have your root. Your root is going to be what keeps the tooth anchored within that socket. And we'll leave it at that. What else do I have here? Periodontal ligaments. roots. Primary tooth erode. And so when we talk about replacement, gradual replacement of deciduous teeth, this periodontal ligament, this is why they fall off. These ligaments in the roots begin to erode. I shouldn't say in, I should say in. And so these periodontal ligaments begin to erode, and then these teeth will be lost, and the new ones will take over. And this is just a quick overview of our teeth. We have our incisors, which are made for clipping and cutting, like scissors, or let that word sort of remind you of that. It says incisors. Canines are going to be for tearing and slashing, typically it's for tearing off meat. And then premolars are for crushing. You're going to see that other animals, like ones that are like camels, for example, cows, if you look at their premolars, they have dominant molars because they do more crushing of plants. And you even see even their chewing method is different, right? They grind like, sideways, like that mandible is going sideways. And it's because they're more premolar and molar dominant. And because, again, they have to crush all that vegetation to consume it. So you can expect that these are always going to be a little bit more flatter, right? Molars are flat, premolars slightly flat, but still have that like slight ability to, like a chisel, sort of be able to like really crush into things. And that's really it. And next thing to add. Let's see. Okay. And so, when we look at this segment now, when we look at our stomach, there are mesenteries. We have a mesentery here, right? This is the same mesentery we discussed before. It's the one that's supposed to provide a pathway for blood vessels, nerves, and it's just that glue that holds it all together. There is the same thing, a mesentery around the stomach. Instead of it being called the mesentery, though, it's called omentum. And when we look at the stomach, you'll see in lab, you have to learn lesser curvature, greater curvature. Excuse me. And so lesser curvature is going to have the lesser omentum. It's going to have, that's what the mesentery here is called. That tissue is just called lesser omentum because this is the lesser curvature. This is the greater curvature, therefore greater omentum. And the role of it is to, again, do the same thing that mesentery does. Keep the organ in contact with the wall, with the body cavity, and also to provide a pathway for blood vessels to innervate the organ and serve it. And when we look at our stomach, the stomach is unique in its muscular layer. We have 2 layers in all those organs we've discussed so far. Every single one of them has 2 layers, longitudinal and circular. But the stomach has a special one referred to as oblique. And so the oblique one sends or transfers things in this manner, this method, sends it in an oblique manner. And so if we look at the length of the lines here, these lines, these longitudinal ones will send it in a long direction. This one will do that circular motion for peristalsis, circular motion along the whole thing. And the oblique one will send it in this angle. So the stomach has a major responsibility in churning, right? Churning and moving and mixing with hydrochloric acid. And so it needs an extra layer, and that's what makes the stomach unique, is that it has an oblique layer. Here we can see the lesser curvature, the greater curvature. When we look at the top of it, we see something that looks like a fungal cap. Remember, like when you look at a fungus, it looks like this. That's sort of what it's named after. I know it's really silly, but it is what it's named after. The fundus, fungal, like fungus, fundus. And then we have this segment that sits inferior to the heart. It's called the cardia. And here's our entry into the stomach, into the esophagus. So I like this image because it's just a general anatomy of the stomach that we need to know for our lab exam. So make sure that we log it away even for the lecture exam. And here you can see we have wrinkles. What does wrinkles in Spanish? What's the Spanish word for wrinkles? Aruga. And so this word ruga, that's where it comes from. And so that's where the word aruga comes from in Spanish. Remember, we're learning Latin more than anything. And so these wrinkles are where we're going to have all of these gastrointestinal pits, these gastric pits, and they secrete hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes. And so these ruga, you're seeing all the wrinkles there, and we don't have to get into the nitty-gritty of what they secrete, but you just need to know secrete hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes. They secrete it out of these gastric pits, and now within the stomach, you have all those useful digestive enzymes and the hydrochloric acid being mixed by our 3 layers of muscles. Question? Oh. Hydrochloric acid, HCl. HCl, hydrochloric acid. I'll write it for the video. Hydrochloric acid. HCl. And digestive enzymes. All right. So we've made our way to the small intestine, and then we just got to finish up on large and the last accessories. And so when we look at our small intestines, you do not need to know what regions are in which, but this should look familiar to all of you. The umbilical region, epigastric, hypogastric, the lumbar, hypochondriac, these are all terms to designate abdominal regions. Abdominal regions. And then so if we look at our duodenum, it's going to be the most superficial part. Oh, sorry. The small intestine is made out of 3 regions: duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Try to remember DJ ileum, DJ, right? Like it just helps to remember the order, DJ, and DJ ileum, right? So D is going to be the shortest segment, duodenum. This is what I like to just call, for my own sake, I know it's not typically may not be referred to as this, as the prep station, right? We've left the stomach, we're very acidic, and if we don't neutralize that acid before we get here, we're in trouble. And so the duodenum is responsible for the neutralization of that acid. And so again, I call it a prepping station, but sometimes this textbook calls it a mixing bowl because it's going to receive chyme from the stomach, right? And it has, then I'll leave it like that. And then so it has hydrochloric acid. And then so now other accessory organs like the liver and the pancreas need to place something in that duodenum to neutralize that acid. But remember, once we enter the stomach, we are no longer bolus, we are chyme. Chyme goes into the duodenum. Okay. And we'll talk about the secretions of the liver and the pancreas in a second, so I don't have to do it twice. And actually, let's do it now. Actually, it works great with the small intestine. And here, perfect. Yes, it does. And so here's our duodenum. This is just that first part. And now we see that we are surrounded, or the duodenum is surrounded by the pancreas and the liver. So this duodenum is our mixing bowl, our prep station. And so chyme has arrived, and now the pancreas and the liver will secrete substances into that space. You can even see their pathways. Like as this produces substances, it puts it into something called the pancreatic duct, and this pancreatic duct will release its substances into that space. The liver will produce substance, again, it's called bile. It'll push it down, and send it into that space. When the liver is not sending its secretions into that space, it'll place it instead into the gallbladder, and then the gallbladder will store and concentrate bile, which breaks down fats, and then it'll traverse down into this duct, which has names, but right now, you don't need to worry about that right now. I just want you to understand. And then these ducts are going to go through and submit their secretions. So the pancreas secretes, the liver secretes as the chyme arrives at the duodenum. Now, what is the liver producing? It produces bile. Fats have a real hard time of breaking down, even in the presence of hydrochloric acid in your stomach. And so it relies on bile, because bile is this special molecule that's just special at breaking down or just making fats smaller so that we can absorb them better. They also, oh, sorry. And then the next thing it does, when you receive blood, right? Like, what's the next role of the liver? That's its role in breakdown. But let's say after we've absorbed things, let's look at a better picture. Let's use this one. When you look at this image, we will see later today when we talk about our blood vessels, is that all these blood vessels are anchoring right there. There, even our small intestine is served by a bunch of blood vessels. This is our large intestine, so it doesn't really apply to what I want to get at. But what I want to get at is that even your small intestine looks like this. It looks like it has blood vessels completely anchored to it. And the second that you absorb anything, it goes into circulation. And so what this point is trying to get at, and I'll be able to re-establish this again when we talk about blood vessels after this lecture, is that the small intestine itself will also have capillaries. The small intestine, these structures will have blood vessels anchored to it, and then everything that gets absorbed into your blood vessels will go into your liver. Absolutely everything. After the small intestine, when you get absorbed into the bloodstream, where do we go? We go into the liver. The liver not only produces bile and helps break things down for breakdown and digestion and absorption, but the second you absorb it in the small intestine, it goes into your blood flow and then goes to your liver for processing. Your liver is like the sorter. It, like everything that arrives in the digestive tract, in the small intestine, it sees protein, 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 sugar, sugar, sugar. Okay, I need to turn this into this. I need to save this. I need to, you know what I mean? I need this. It's just the one that's keeping track of everything entering your system. And so in this instance, though, it only has, we're talking about its ability to aid in digestion. And in this case, it's talking about it processes everything that you're absorbing. It produces cholesterol, and recall that cholesterol is an important substance that you encounter in your plasma membranes that gives it a certain rigidity. And again, it produces specialized proteins to help carry fat. So this is a fact I don't really care for you to hold on to, and neither the cholesterol one, but just I like your notes to be complete, a little bit more complete. And then if we look at our associated structures with our gallbladder, we see, with our liver, our gallbladder is just stores bile and concentrates it. The word ducts is the same way you think about an air duct, like, in a spy movie, someone's traveling through the ducts. It just means a passageway. And so you can see if this organ is our pancreas, the passageway here is called the pancreatic duct. And then this segment here where the bile needs to travel through is called the common bile duct. And common, this is going to be important after the break, is that common refers to a branching system. And so the common bile duct means that it's gonna branch or it did branch. And we'll talk about that today a little bit more when we talk about blood vessels. But common, again, you can see, on our screen, we have a little bit of a breakdown. Let me make this larger here. And then, so here, this common, you can see it's common, and then it's gonna go in this direction or this direction. If it goes towards the gallbladder, it's called a cystic duct. If it goes towards the liver, it's called the left and the right hepatic duct. Don't be intimidated about lobes. It's easy to tell which one's which. The liver sits on the right-hand side of the body. So that right-hand side has all the space in the world, so it needs that the right lobe is larger on the liver. So the one that goes to the right is going to be going to the larger lobe. The larger lobe is the right one. The smaller one is the left one. And so the duct that goes left hepatic duct. The one that goes right hepatic duct. Now, in that same duodenum, we have our pancreas, and our pancreas is going to secrete digestive enzymes, and it's also going to secrete something called bicarbonate. And what did I write here? I secreted. All I wrote was buffer, and I'm going to keep it that way to keep it simple. I'll let physio teach you all that, the nitty-gritty on bicarbonate. But otherwise, here you can see the pancreas is the entire cottage cheese organ. It has a head, it has a tail, but you don't need to know this, just an FYI if you ever see this again. And then this duct will allow for pancreatic juices. That's what it's actually called. And it's a combination of water, ions, and more importantly, buffers to help neutralize acids. That's what I want you to know. Buffers to neutralize the stomach acid, and more digestive enzymes that just help break down those things that you've ingested further down into smaller components. And the only last thing to add here is when you look at this opening has a name because it's shared between the pancreas and the common bile duct, or the liver, right? The liver is sending its bile secretion. This has a name. You're seeing ampulla here, but the appropriate name is what I wrote here in asterisk: hepatopancreatic sphincter. That's going to be the muscle that regulates the passage of things from flowing in through that space. And it'll keep you safe. You'll always know what anyone's talking about when they say sphincter, hepatopancreatic sphincter, or the ampulla. Sometimes you'll see it as ampulla, and then you'll also see it as duodenal papilla. But I think the safest definition that's more common is hepatopancreatic sphincter, because it's the muscle that regulates the passage of things going into that duodenum. All right, and we are almost there. Hang in there, hang in there. And so we see now where we left off on our duodenum. It neutralizes our acidic chyme because the pancreas secretes things into that hepatopancreatic sphincter through that hepatopancreatic sphincter. And then as we progress further, we have now in this purple segment on my screen, we have our jejunum. This jejunum is going to be where all the absorption is going to occur, hence why you have a lot of circular folds. We see this note that I pretty much skipped because it has few circular folds. Why? Because the circular folds, as we said earlier, were involved in increasing surface area. But there's no absorption really going on here. It's a mixing bowl, a prep station. And the jejunum, this is where all the absorbing is occurring. So therefore, we can expect has numerous circular folds and a bunch of villi, where in the duodenum, we really didn't care for villi, right? Because villi were about absorbing. And this is, again, where we're going to be absorbing our nutrients, and also where those enzymes play a big role in breaking things down further for that final absorption step. And now the ileum. The ileum is going to be the last stage, or the last bit of that small intestine. The valve, something that prevents feces from going back into your small intestine, is called the ileocecal valve. And it's a muscle, a sphincter, that just prevents things from going into your large intestine. It doesn't really have a lot of circular folds because anything that you've absorbed has already pretty much been absorbed, and it has more lymph nodes. And let's describe that. When we look here, this was our jejunum, and then we saw our ileum is finally reaching the very end of its pathway, and that's why we have this image. I'll come back to whatever that is. Here's our ileum, the end of it. And so we're already almost feces. We're not doing a lot of absorbing here. And you're going to have a lot of lymphatic tissues there. You'll learn what that is in your next lecture video. And then so lymphatics is again involved in immunity. And so finally, feces will go through into the large intestine. We're done with absorbing the major nutrients. Now we are pretty much feces. And this thing that I have circled here is your ileocecal valve. Look at the name. Ileo coming from ileum. Cecal coming from that this is your cecum. Cecum. As like shown here, cecum. So this is called your ileocecal valve. And so this ileocecal valve prevents backflow, and so feces will passage its way through. But before I go on to the large intestine, or we finish up with the large intestine, is that if we look at the mucosal layer now, this image looks a little confusing, but if we look at our ileum, DJ ileum, right? DJ ileum. If we look at the duodenum, you can see it's different on the inside. Different on the inside, different on the inside. It may not look so apparent, but you can see the circular folds aren't as profound as they are in the jejunum. As the simplest example, I'm just the one I'm going to use, and that's the real difference. And what my hope is for today is that you're seeing that if you're a piece of food and you entered the someone's oral cavity, and let's just imagine you didn't get chewed up and destroyed, and you're just able to watch the inner lining of everything changes as you progress through from the oral cavity all the way down through the anus. And this is just an image just to sort of show that even the small intestine itself, the mucosa layer, is different. It has different characteristics to it. Different characteristics. And to finish up is now we have now reached the feces stage. And so here we have our cecum we left the ileum. We've gone through our ileocecal valve, and now feces is in this space called the cecum. You'll see this little thing that hangs here. This is called the appendix. And this appendix has a few bits of information, or as far as like theories or concepts around what it does. And it stores a little bit of useful bacteria that helps with the breakdown of indigestible things. You have a little storage pouch of useful bacteria that help you break down things that you could not break down in your small intestines, and it makes it easier either to defecate or even to absorb some of those extra leftover things that we can absorb from feces. And so hence that's why it's so important to get it removed when you get an infection, because if this bacteria, it's good at living in here in the large intestine without killing you. But if this little bacteria gets out, then they're capable of infecting all these other tissues and causing death. And so that's why appendix, even though it's the simplest surgery in the world, it is a very important one to get when you're having when it's inflamed or when you have an infection. And so the role of the large intestine can be characterized as it collects and stores feces until you need either water, salts to pull out. It compacts it, meaning that it sort of compresses it, sort of like if you have your trash can and it's full and you sort of step in there to sort of make it smaller and make more room. That's what we mean by compact. So it compresses the feces. And again, do not forget, from the ileum, it's the ileocecal valve. I put this one purposefully because it's in your lab manual, and that's why I omitted those other ones that exist. So this is just the best one to hold on to. And then our colon now. The word colon always implies to the whole thing. I know that you might have heard it in different contexts, whether in humor or just movies or something, but keep in mind that when we refer to the colon, we are always referencing the entire large intestine. And so, simply though, which makes it really easy, once you understand that, it's really easy. Ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid. In that order, we have ascending, we have transverse, descending, sigmoidal, where it makes like a little S. You see that S? Here's a little backwards S. It's not the perfect S, but it's an S. Sigmoidal, hence sigmoidal. And then finally, rectum is going to be the last stage. Otherwise, nothing more to add there. Flexures are the turning corners, and you only have two, the right colic flexure and the left colic flexure. If you look here, all it is, it's this segment. This segment. Let me write it in for the video. Here, oops, darker color. This flexure, this bend here, and this bend. That's all it is. It's just where it folds. Where you travel up as an ascending, the second you become transverse, you had to fold here. That's all a flexure is. That's all a flexure is. And so it's capable of moving things just like any other organ with smooth muscles through peristalsis. The desire to go, the necessity to go, number two, to go and produce feces, to defecate, occurs from distension in the stomach, meaning that when your stomach has expanded because more food has come in, your small intestine's like, well, better get rid of this stuff. And then that's kind of what this statement meant. That's fine. This is honestly, what it's just trying to say is that the real pushing doesn't really begin from here, but don't worry about that. That's just a fact that we don't really care if you know. Major characteristics of the large intestine. And then lax villi, and anything else? You know, the only one I really care for you to add is the glands are different, so we can not care about this. Villi, we just need to know what it does in the small intestine. It's okay. And you don't need to worry about this. Mucus does not produce enzymes. It's okay. What matters is just this little statement here. Is that one thing that's very unique about the large intestine is that it has a lot of goblet cells, more so than all those other areas that we've learned about goblet cells, whether it's the respiratory tract or the small intestines. And I will just say that the mucus content is just slightly different, as you'll learn a little bit maybe later down the line, if it matters for whatever subject or your professional school. But the mucus lubricates that feces, and that's what makes it drier and more compact. Okay, it lubricates it without keeping it too moist, and then but it also makes it dries it out and more compact. And then we made it to the final part, our rectum. What to draw from here? When you are about to release feces, you have two sphincters. You have a sphincter that's internal and one that's more external. So the first one you encounter is the internal anal sphincter, and this is anything called the sphincter is typically a circular muscle. And so in this case, this is going to be unique from your external one because this one is smooth muscle. That's the take home here, is the internal one is smooth. This is why it's so hard to control the urge when you really got to go. You don't have perfect control of it because the smooth muscle's like, yo, this doesn't fit in here anymore. This is got to come out. It's got to go out. It's trying to push it out. But the skeletal one is the one that we're really grateful for. It's the one that we're able to control its exit. So just to recap with a picture, this one you do not have control over. This one you do. This one's made out of skeletal muscle. This one's made out of smooth muscle. So this one's always trying to contract, trying to push out. And this is the one that you're sort of, puckering when you really got to go. That's the external anal sphincter. And again, this one we control. The one that's smooth, we never control. And finally, anus is the exit. And last little fun note to add here is your skin is keratinized, stratified squamous. The inside of your mouth and your throat is made out of the same thing that your skin is. The only difference is that this is keratinized. I don't know if we remember what that is. It just means that the cells have keratin inside of them, making them harder, dead little bricks. The ones in my mouth are not. They're not keratinized. But the ones that are on the exit, this is where we see that they're not keratinized, not keratinized. And then finally, the second that we exit, we become keratinized. And so that's just a little fun fact to add there. And then our glands. We have 3 glands we care about. These are not tonsils, these are glands. We have our parotid, otic, typically implied ear. So parotid means next to the ear gland. We have our submandibular gland and our sublingual that sits underneath the tongue. Submandibular sits underneath the mandible. And for us, the functions: secrete saliva with digestive enzymes. All right. And that wraps up digestive.